Hey guys, what is up? Excoundrel here. I'm feeling much better today, and I thought I'd finally get my CP item guide part 2 out. I know a lot of you were asking for this, so I just did it. Just went ahead and did it. So in the first guide, which I'll link in a card, we covered Shatterglass, Frostburn, and Aftershock. So today we are going to move on to 3 more items, and we're going to cover Broken Myth, Eve of Harvest, and Echo. Echo quite fittingly, as it is very popular right now, given the changes. So let's start with Broken Myth. Now, Broken Myth, on stats-wise, is 10% Pierce, which means it pierces 10% of the enemy shield, giving you 10% true damage, and you get 70 Crystal Power, and it builds out of Heavy Prism and a Piercing Shard. Its unique passive is that you gain a Broken Myth stack for every second you're attacking an enemy. So every second that you are dealing CP damage, or if you deal CP damage once every second, you gain a stack, and that builds up to 9 stacks, giving you a total of 36% increase on crystal damage. Now, that is not your increase on CP, so this doesn't increase your current CP. What this does increase is the damage that your abilities deal. So that will also include base damages that you get from level. So for instance, Heliogenesis on Celeste will get an increase in CP damage per level. Broken Myth will also affect that, as well as the CP damage that comes from the scaling from the items that you buy, if that makes sense. So basically it is a total increase on your ability damage. As you can see, I said, affects crystal damage and not crystal power. So what this really means is that Broken Myth is very, very, very good if you are one of those carries that spams abilities, especially spams abilities from ranged, but in general, if you're using abilities to deal crystal damage, Broken Myth is going to make you better. And that is just in the way that if you build those stacks and you use Heliogenesis, between 1 and 9 stacks, your Supernova is going to deal 36% extra damage, which is a lot of extra damage. Or your Rhyme Frostspire is going to deal 36% extra damage, which has so many knock-on effects to other parts of the kits of these heroes. It is very, very important. So if we look at this item in general, it's pretty much required on all CP carries. Most CP carries have abilities that deal damage, and therefore most CP carries are going to get a benefit out of Broken Myth. It helps CP carries scale into the late game as well, because without Broken Myth, you are kind of capped on the damage you do. I'll put it this way. Weapon power carries have Critical Strike, which amplify their damage. CP carries don't have anything like that. They don't have Critical Strike for abilities, but they do have Broken Myth, which is a static way of increasing your ability damage. And it's really, really good as a second item on 2-item CP carries like Koshka or CP Blackfeather, who generally tend to build 2 CP items. Now, it's really, really good on CP carries that have a high crystal base damage but low scaling. So for instance, if you don't get a lot out of building huge amounts of crystal power, but your abilities have really, really good base damages, then you're going to get massive effect out of Broken Myth. Things like Koshka and Rhyme, they get huge effect out of Broken Myth. So that's one thing about it. It's the only item that pierces shield as well. And like I said, if you build stacks in a late game team fight, it can devastate people because of how much damage a 9-stacked carry can do. Now let's look at Eve of Harvest. I know this is Jinko's favourite item. It gives you a bit of CP lifesteal as well as some stats towards your CP and energy, but its unique passive is an interesting one. The next portion of CP damage that you deal, depending on your level, to an enemy has extra 25% CP lifesteal added to it, which means that the first burst of damage that you deal to an enemy hero will have 35% CP lifesteal, including the 10% that you get with Eve of Harvest, and that recharges over 40 seconds. Now, to put that into context, recharge is not cooldown. So, let's say at level 12, you deal 1200 CP damage, and then don't attack for 20 seconds, it will recharge to 600 damage that gets the 35% lifesteal, because it has gone halfway through its recharge, and that's halfway to 1200, if that makes sense. So it recharges, not cooldown, over 40 seconds. Now, Eve of Harvest is an item that is very interesting. It's the only CP sustain item in the game, and it's pretty much necessary on CP carries that deal consistent damage, that are very squishy, and would rely on the sustain to be able to survive in teamfights. I'm talking about the likes of Sky, Scarf, Celeste, all of which spam abilities, all of which get major use out of Eve of Harvest. So Eve of Harvest is really good on CP carries that are heavy damage, but squishy, and the sustain could keep them alive. Not so good on your assassins like Koshka. It's an item that is surplus to requirements there, but very, very good on your ranged CP carries mostly, and also on people like Rhyme, who rely on Eve of Harvest for their health sustain as opposed to their fortified health. Now, it's not a very good first item. That's to say that CP lifesteal is all based on the amount of damage you deal. So let's say you build it as your first item. It's likely that you're going to hit this before you've maxed your first ability, so all of your ability damage will be low, and you also don't have much CP to add to the scaling of that damage. So CP lifesteal at that point is going to be next to nothing, so therefore it's very rarely built as a first item unless you are someone like Rhyme. Rhyme is the only person that I would ever really condone building an Eve of Harvest first on. Maybe Samuel, but Rhyme especially is the only carry that I would really say that Eve of Harvest is good on as a first item. Unless you're super energy reliant. But then Rhyme is kind of energy reliant, and also Samuel can be. But Rhyme realistically is the only item that I would, this item where I would say is a good first item. It works very, very well with Broken Myth. So we just talked about Broken Myth a second ago. The CP lifesteal comes from total CP damage dealt, including CP damage from your abilities. And, well, Broken Myth increases your ability damage. So after Broken Myth, often Eve of Harvest comes as an item, because the more Broken Myth stacks you get, the more sustain that the Eve of Harvest is going to provide. So, in conclusion, for Eve of Harvest, it is a very, very, very good item for sustained mages who have high CP scaling and high CP damage, because it provides a lot of health regen for them, where you don't often have that in CP build paths. And it's really, really good as an addition to a later item spike. It's not so good early on because you won't have the levels or the CP to make it worth it, and you are just way better off going something like Frostburn, Shattered Glass, or Broken Myth first. So this is a supplement as a second or third item at the least. Very rarely would you build this as a first item unless you are a Rhyme. You can also consider this on CP-based bruisers and assassins like Koshka or Reza if the sustain is needed to survive in teamfights. For instance, a popular Reza build right now is Aftershock, Broken Myth, and Eve of Harvest because it adds to the defense that you already build. If you're dealing high amounts of damage as a CP bruiser and you have defense, you are going to gain life that is harder for the enemy to take away because of the defenses that you have built. For instance, if I have a metal jacket and an Aegis as a Reza, and I'm regenerating, I don't know, let's say 50 to 100 health every time I get a combo off, that 50 to 100 health, I am going to get flat, but the enemy has to pierce my defenses to take that away. So any health you gain back when you have defenses is going to be worth more, because it is harder then for the enemy to then burst through your high amount of armor and shielding that you have to take that health away from you. That's why it can be good on these types of heroes. Now, moving on to our last item, which is Echo. Echo is an item that gives 300 max energy and 4 energy recharge, and it builds out of a Void Battery. Now, before we go into Echo in detail, let's talk about how to use it. Activating Echo is kind of sometimes hard to understand. The way that it works is that you have to use it directly after using the ability that you want Echo to affect. So let's say you're Catherine, you want to get a double ultimate off, you use Blast Tremor, you use Echo to bring Blast Tremor back on cooldown, and then you can use Blast Tremor again. If you use Blast Tremor and then try and use your stun before using Echo, and use Echo afterwards, it's just going to refresh your stun. So you have to be very careful on your timing of the use of Echo. And the cooldown you can see below, the cooldown of Echo is always going to be greater than the cooldown of the ability that you used it on. So that's just something to take away there. Stats-wise, Echo is incredibly slot inefficient. Now, before we dive into too much, I want to talk about slot efficiency. Slot efficiency is the way that we use to describe how good an item is for a hero, or how good an item is in a build. You have 6 slots. Usually, one of those is always going to be occupied by boots. So then you have 5 slots to work with in terms of items. You want to get the maximum impact from those items. And often, it's about getting the best stats for the item slot. Echo has crap stats, really bad stats, so it's really slot inefficient. However, That very much depends on the ability that you used it on. So therefore, Echo is going to be great on some heroes and bad on others. And that's why it's really good to understand exactly where Echo can be good. As it does very little to empower the abilities themselves. All it does is it gives you energy and energy regen, which is almost next to useless for a lot of heroes. I mean, obviously it's great, but it doesn't really empower the abilities that you're using. But it's very good at chaining high impact abilities. So when is Echo good? Well, first of all, the most popular way of using Echo in the current meta is using it on captains who don't build to empower their abilities anyway. So for instance, if you're playing a Catherine, you're playing a Captain Baptiste, or you're playing an Arden, you're not really building CP most of the time. You're not building weapon power, you're not trying to empower your abilities, you're building fountains, you're building crucibles, you're building war treads, things that either help your team or just give you flat out defense. So therefore, an Echo for these guys suddenly doesn't become as slot inefficient because you're not really building to empower and deal damage anyway. However, you do need to build it on the right captains. It's not something that you can build on any captain and say, ha, Echo, I win. No, you need to build it on captains that have got high impact abilities. And we're talking about the likes of Gauntlet, a super high impact ability for Arden on a long cooldown. Blast Tremor, you can chain together to get a ridiculously long silence in a team fight. Fearsome Shade on Baptiste is incredibly powerful. And also, you might see it sometimes on Grace for her Echo Ultimate, which gives her major healing and damage reduction on targets. You might also see it on carries who have single target focused abilities that are high impact. For instance, a CP Ringo, getting a double Hellfire Brew can be really ridiculous. So therefore, sometimes you'll see it on carries like that. But for the most part, you'll generally tend to see Echo on captains with high impact abilities. The biggest decision with Echo is deciding whether the item slot trade-off is actually worth it. That's to say, you're sacrificing an item in your build to build a really bad item in terms of stats, but you have an ability that is worth getting off cooldown twice in a team fight. So it's a really high impact item, but a really bad stats item. So it's all about deciding whether you have a hero that has an impactful enough ability to warrant getting rid of an item slot and spending that amount of gold in buying the Echo. And often this is just better on captains because you don't have to worry about needing those items to hit item spikes for offense. So that's why you'll generally tend to see Echo built on captains more frequently than anything else. So, you know, I've seen it on Finn, I've seen it on Arden, I've seen it on Catherine, I've seen it on Grace, I've seen it on Captain Baptiste. And I think you'll find throughout the course of the 2.7 meta that captains that benefit from Echo because of Echo's buff in the last update are going to do well. Hope this has been useful for you guys. I really enjoyed doing this, finally getting around to it after about 3 months. We have 2 more items left to cover, which will be a shorter video, and that'll be, I think it's just Clockwork and Alternating Current left to talk about, and that will be in CP Items Guide Part 3. And then, if any major changes happen to the CP items, or Vainglory or SEMC decide to bring out any more CP items in future updates, I will try and cover them in further videos. So, thank you very much guys, hope it's been interesting, and I will see you soon.